The moment Matilda Cooper walked through the doors of Harlan Beecroft's auction barn on the edge of Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, every head in the room turned. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, with copper-bright hair pinned beneath a sun-faded bonnet and eyes the color of creek water in July, but because everyone in Dusty Creek knew that Matilda Cooper did not go to auctions, did not ask for help, and did not cry in public. And yet here she stood, doing all three things at once without making a single sound. The barn smelled of sawdust and old leather, and the particular kind of desperation that only gatherings of this sort could produce. Rows of mismatched chairs had been arranged before a raised platform where Harlan Beecroft, a wide man with a walrus mustache and a voice like a dinner bell, was already warming up his auctioneer's rhythm, testing it against the rafters. A crowd of 40 or 50 people milled about, some genuinely looking to buy, some there purely for the spectacle of watching a man sell off the remnants of someone else's life. That someone was Matilda's grandmother, Eleanor Me Cooper, who had passed 6 weeks prior, and whose modest plot of land on the eastern edge of town had been seized by the Dusty Creek Land and Commerce Bank, on account of an unpaid debt that Matilda had only learned about after the funeral. She had scraped together what little she had from her wages at the dress shop, from selling her own silver hairpins and the small brooch her mother had left her, and she had come here today with $34.60 tucked inside her left boot, convinced it would be enough to buy back the one thing that mattered, the table. It was not a grand piece of furniture. Any sensible person passing through the auction would have dismissed it entirely. A rectangular oak table, the surface worn smooth in the center from 40 years of daily use, one leg slightly shorter than the others, so that it tilted just a fraction to the left, the wood darkened near the base from decades of a cast-iron pot sitting too close to the edge. But to Matilda, that table was the kitchen of her grandmother's house. It was Sunday mornings with biscuits and sorghum syrup. It was the place where Eleanor Me had sat with Matilda every winter evening and taught her to read from a single worn Bible, tracing the letters with a gnarled finger. It was the place where Matilda had cried after her mother died of fever when Matilda was 9 years old, and where Eleanor Me had held her and said, "This family does not break, child. We bend, but we do not break." That table had been in the Cooper family since before the war, hauled from Georgia in the back of a wagon by Eleanor Me's own mother when the family had pushed west with nothing but hope and calluses. Matilda needed it back. She had told herself on the walk over that $34.60 was more than a worn old table was worth, and that she would walk out of this barn with it under her arm. She had not accounted for Clyde Keller. He was standing near the back wall, hat in hand, turning the brim slowly between his fingers the way a man does when he is trying to appear casual, but his mind is moving fast. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet and an inch more, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same red sandstone that made up the bluffs east of town. He wore a plain canvas work shirt and dusty trail pants, and his boots were the kind that had seen genuine miles, rather than the decorative spurs some of the younger ranch hands favored. He had the look of a man who worked with his hands and was proud of it, but not the look of a man who came to auctions often. There was a slight uncertainty to the way he held himself in the room, like a man more comfortable under open sky than beneath a roof with strangers. Matilda did not notice him. She was focused on finding a seat near the front, close enough to see the table when it came up, close enough to raise her hand fast before anyone else got ideas. She found a chair in the second row and folded her hands in her lap and waited with the particular stillness of a woman who has already made up her mind and is simply enduring the time between the decision and the outcome. The auction moved through its early items quickly. A broken plow, a horse saddle with a cracked pommel, a set of cast-iron pans, a wardrobe with a missing door. Matilda sat through each one and watched the bidding with a kind of distant academic interest, cataloging who was here to buy and who was here to look. It was during the bidding on a pair of matching rocking chairs that she first became aware of the man at the back. He bid on the chairs, lost them to a farmer's wife in a yellow bonnet, and then settled back against the wall with his arms folded, scanning the room. Their eyes met briefly, and Matilda looked away first, which she immediately resented. She was not a woman who looked away first. The table came up in the 11th lot. Harlan Beecroft had 2 of his boys carry it out, and even in the dusty barn light, even tilted slightly to the left as the boys set it down, it was unmistakably her grandmother's table. Matilda's breath caught somewhere between her sternum and her throat and stayed there. "Now here we have a sturdy piece," Harlan said, patting the surface appreciatively. "Oak construction, good solid build. Would serve a household well for another 40 years, I'd wager. Who'll start me at $5. $5. The number was almost insulting, but Matilda knew better than to let emotion show in an auction house, so she raised her hand calmly and said, "5. 5 from the young lady in the second row. Do I hear 6? A pause. Then from the back of the room, 6. She turned. It was the tall man with the dark hair. He was watching the table, not her, with a faintly evaluative expression on his face, the way a man looks at something he is deciding is worth the trouble. Matilda turned back to Harlan. 8, she said. 8 from the lady. Do I hear 9? 10, said the voice from the back. A murmur moved through the crowd. A few heads swiveled to see who was bidding, and a few more looked at Matilda with that particularly uncomfortable brand of sympathy that small-town people reserve for someone they know is fighting a losing battle. Matilda felt heat climb her neck. She was not going to lose this table to a stranger who did not know what he was looking at. She raised her chin. 15. The crowd shifted. $15 was serious money for a piece of furniture in 1882 Dusty Creek. Harlan's eyebrows went up appreciatively. 15 from the young lady. $15. Do I hear more? The man at the back tilted his head slightly. Something moved across his face, not quite calculation, not quite surprise. 16, he said. Matilda pressed her lips together. 20. Another murmur. Someone behind her whispered something she could not make out. Harlan was delighted, his auctioneer's rhythm picking up pace with the excitement of a genuine bidding contest. $20. Do I hear 21? 21. That is a fine table, folks, a very fine table. From the back, 25. The blood drained from Matilda's face and then rushed back hot. $25. She had $34.60. If she went past $30, she would have almost nothing left for the rest of the month, for food, for the rent on the small room she kept above the dress shop. But she looked at that table. She looked at the worn, smooth center of it, the darkened base, the slight leftward tilt, and she heard Eleanor Mee's voice so clearly it was almost frightening. "This family does not break, child." 30, Matilda said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. A proper silence fell over the barn. Harlan let it hang for theatrical effect, sweeping his gaze to the back of the room. $30. Will anyone challenge 30, sir? Do you wish to continue? Clyde Keller was no longer looking at the table. He was looking at Matilda. She could feel it without turning around, the way you feel a fire without seeing the flames. There was a long pause, long enough for her heart to do 3 full hard beats. 31, he said. The sound that came out of Matilda's mouth was small and involuntary, something between a sharp exhale and the beginning of a word she never finished. Several of the women near her turned to look with worried eyes. She had $4.60 left if she bid 31. She had the rent coming in 11 days. She turned around in her chair. It was the first time she had looked directly at him since the bidding started, and when their eyes met, she wanted him to see exactly what he was doing. She wanted him to understand that he was not bidding against a woman trying to furnish a house. She wanted him to feel the weight of what he held in his casual, infuriating hand. But his expression when he met her gaze was not smug. It was not the expression of a man enjoying himself at someone else's expense. He looked slightly troubled, actually, which confused her. She turned back. She could not go higher. She absolutely could not. 31 going once, Harlan said. Matilda stared at the table. 31 going twice. She felt something in her chest collapse, like a fence post rotting through at the base and giving way on a quiet afternoon with nobody watching. Sold for $31 to the gentleman in the back. The sound in the room resumed, chairs scraping, Harlan moving to the next lot, conversations bubbling back up. Matilda sat completely still for 3 full seconds before she gathered herself, pressed her palms to her thighs and stood. She was not going to sit here. She was not going to let 40 people watch Matilda Cooper sit in a chair and absorb this quietly. She walked toward the exit, keeping her eyes forward, her back straight, her grandmother's voice somewhere in the back of her mind reminding her that a Cooper did not make a scene, did not fall apart in front of neighbors, did not let the world see the fault lines. She pushed through the barn door and stepped into the October afternoon. The sunlight hit her hard and honest after the dimness of the barn, and Matilda walked 20 paces away from the building before she stopped, pressed her back against the old cottonwood tree by the fence post, tilted her head back, and let the tears come fast and private, the way she had taught herself to cry all at once over quickly, no residue. She was drying her face with the back of her wrist when she heard boots on the hard dirt behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the Beecroft boys with a slip of paper or some other business formality, and instead found herself looking up at the tall man with the dark hair. He was holding his hat. He was looking at her with that same slightly troubled expression he'd worn inside, and he had not come to gloat. She could see that much right away. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You do not owe me a single thing," Matilda said. Her voice was flat and clear. "You won a fair auction. That is the nature of the thing. I bid against you 7 times, he said, as if she might have lost count. "I know how many times." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I didn't know," he said. "About the table, I didn't know what it was to you." Matilda looked at him carefully. "And what exactly do you know now?" He met her gaze squarely. His eyes were a dark, earnest brown, the color of good creek-bottom mud. "I know that you paid a price in that room that had nothing to do with money," he said. "And I know I helped drive you to it without knowing what I was doing." Matilda studied him for a moment. She had grown up in a town small enough that she knew most faces if not all names, but she did not know this man, and that was notable in itself. "You are not from Dusty Creek," she said. "No, ma'am. I came in from the Keller Ranch, about 4 miles east on the Painted Creek Road. Been running cattle there for the past 3 years. I know the Keller land," she said slowly. "I didn't know there was anyone working it. My uncle left it to me," he said. "Clyde Keller." He put his hand out. She looked at it for a moment, then shook it with a firm, brief grip. Her own hand was calloused from her years at the dress shop, from the needle and the heavy fabric irons, and when his fingers closed around hers, she felt the roughness of a man who worked outside in all weathers. "Matilda Cooper. The grandmother's table," he said, and the way he said it told her something had already shifted in him since the gavel came down. "Aline or me Cooper's table," she said. "She raised me at it, taught me everything I know at it. I grew up in that kitchen." She stopped, annoyed at herself for explaining more than she had intended to. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters," Clyde said. She looked at him with a directness that made most men uncomfortable. He did not flinch from it. "I bought the table to furnish a ranch house," he said, carefully and plainly. "I don't have a particular attachment to it. I bid because I needed a good table and the price was right, and I didn't know the price was right because someone was spending money they couldn't afford to spend." He paused. "I am not a man who takes things from people." "Then give it back," Matilda said. She did not mean it to come out quite so bluntly, but it did, and she stood by it. He did not flinch. "That is what I am standing here to discuss," he said, "but it has to be a proper transaction. I paid $31 for that table and I need a table, so if you want it back, we need to work something out." "I have $4.60 left in this world," she said, with a frankness that surprised even her. "So unless you are willing to consider that a sufficient offer, I am not sure what transaction you have in mind." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat again. Not a nervous gesture, She was beginning to understand a thinking gesture. The hat turning was what Clyde Keller did when he was working something out. "Can you cook?" he asked. The question was so unexpected that Matilda stared at him. "I don't mean any disrespect," he said quickly. "The ranch needs a cook. I have 2 hands living on the property and none of us can produce a meal worth eating. I have been paying old Walter Spriggs from town to come out twice a week, and the man makes nothing but salt pork and cornmeal mush and charges me $6 a month for the privilege. If you came and cooked proper meals, say, 5 days a week, I would call the table your wages, and at the end of 30 days the table would be entirely and legally yours." Matilda's first instinct was to refuse. It had been her instinct to refuse things from strangers her entire adult life, a habit born of a childhood in which need and pride had been in constant negotiation. But she was 24 years old, and she was standing outside an auction barn, having just lost the single most important object in her life to a man who was now offering her a genuine way to get it back. "What would the arrangement look like?" she asked. "You would ride out to the ranch 5 mornings a week, cook dinner at midday and supper in the evening, and ride back to town before dark or stay in the spare room if the weather was poor. There would be nothing improper about it. My 2 hands, Pete Avery and Doris Rankin's boy Sam, they are there every day, and Pete's wife comes out on Fridays. It would be fully respectable. I work at the dress shop Monday through Saturday morning," she said. "Then come after your half day on Saturday and full days Sunday through Thursday," he said. "We can make the meals work around your hours." She thought about it. She thought about the table sitting in that barn with a sold slip on it, and she thought about a leaner me, and she thought about the $31 she did not have. 30 days, she said. 30 days, and the table is yours with a signed bill of sale." She looked at his hand again, then back at his face. "I will need that in writing before I cook a single meal," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was something adjacent to one. "Fair enough," he said. They went back into the barn together, and Clyde Keller paid Harlan Beecroft for the table, and then he borrowed a sheet of Harlan's paper and a pencil, and wrote out the terms of their agreement in clear, straightforward language, and Matilda read every word of it twice before she signed her name and watched him sign his. She folded the paper and put it in her boot next to what was left of her money. Clyde watched her do it, and she thought she saw something register in his face, something like respect. "I'll bring a wagon for the table tomorrow morning," he said. "Can you be ready to ride out with it?" "I can." He put his hat back on. "Thank you, Miss Cooper." "Thank you, Mr. Keller," she said, and walked back into the afternoon sun feeling slightly unsteady, the way you feel when you have narrowly avoided a catastrophe and the adrenaline has not yet decided what to do with itself. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her narrow bed above the dress shop and stared at the low ceiling and thought about the arrangement she had made, turning it over the way you turn a found coin, looking for the flaw that would render it worthless. But there was no flaw she could find. Clyde Keller had written a clear and fair agreement. He had not taken advantage of her desperation. He had offered her a way out that preserved her dignity and his both, and she could find nothing wrong with it, which was almost more unsettling than if she could. She rose before dawn and dressed carefully, practical clothes for riding and working in a ranch kitchen, a brown wool skirt and a sturdy cotton blouse, and her grandmother's old lace-up boots that had more life in them than her own. She ate a piece of bread with butter and was waiting outside the dress shop when Clyde Keller arrived with a wagon and a mule at 7:30 in the morning. He touched his hat brim when he saw her. She nodded back. The table was already in the wagon bed, wrapped loosely in burlap. She climbed up onto the seat before he could offer a hand, and he went around to his own side without comment. They drove east on the Painted Creek Road with the October sun just clearing the bluffs, painting everything in that particular gold that the Texas plains produce in autumn like a promise of things that are almost out of reach. For the first quarter mile, neither of them said anything. The creak and sway of the wagon filled the silence without discomfort, which Matilda noted with something approaching surprise. She was not a woman who suffered silence well, generally. She filled it with conversation or with work, but with Clyde there was an unusual quality to the quiet, as if it were not empty but simply patient. "How long was your grandmother in Dusty Creek?" he asked eventually, eyes on the road. "Since before I was born," Matilda said. "She came from Georgia in 1851 with her mother and her husband, my grandfather Daniel Cooper. He died of fever on the trail, and she brought herself and the wagon the rest of the way west alone, with 3 children under the age of 7. She paused. "She used to tell me that was the hardest thing she ever did, not because it was dangerous, but because she had to decide every single morning not to turn around." Clyde was quiet for a moment. "That takes a particular kind of character," he said. "She had it in abundance." Matilda looked out at the passing landscape, the scrubby cedars and the red rock outcroppings, the yellow grass moving in the thin morning breeze. "What about you? Where did your family come from?" "Missouri, originally. My father's side came out with the cattle drives in the 60s. Uncle Hector was the one who bought the land here, but he never married and there were no other heirs, so when he died 2 years ago it came to me. He adjusted the reins. I grew up on a working farm. I know livestock, but I'm still learning this particular piece of country." "It's good land," Matilda said. "The eastern pastures near Painted Creek have good grass and good water. Dusty Creek proper floods in bad years, but the creek branch that runs through the Keller property is better managed." He glanced at her sideways. "You know the land well." "I spent summers out here as a girl," she said. "My grandmother's property wasn't far from yours. I know every rock and gully for 6 miles in any direction." He nodded slowly as if filing this away. "Then, what happened to your grandmother's land?" "The auction notice said the bank took it." Matilda felt the familiar tightening in her jaw. "She borrowed against it to pay for my mother's doctor visits, years ago. My mother was sick for a long time before she died. The debt went unpaid for years because my grandmother was too proud to tell anyone, including me, that she was carrying it. By the time I found out after the funeral, it was already too late to negotiate with the bank. The First Commercial Bank of Dusty Creek is not what you would call a sympathetic institution. The Hearst Bank. Gerald Hearst owns it, yes." Her tone said everything she declined to put into words. "I've heard the name," Clyde said carefully. "Some of the men in town have opinions about how he does business." "The opinions are justified," she said. They rode in silence again for a stretch, and then the Keller ranch came into view around a bend in the road, a substantial property, actually, more than she had expected. A main house built of good timber with a covered porch, a large barn, a fenced pasture where a small herd of cattle moved in the morning light, and 2 smaller outbuildings that looked to be a smokehouse and a tool shed. "This is larger than I expected," she said. "My uncle built well," Clyde said, "and there was pride in it." He pulled the wagon around to the back of the house, to the kitchen door, and she climbed down and stood looking at the place. The kitchen was visible through the open door, and even from outside she could see it was functional but unloved. A good cast-iron stove, a solid table for work preparation, shelves of mismatched crockery, and the general air of a room managed by men who used it only for necessity and not for pleasure. "I'll show you where everything is," he said, and led her inside. The kitchen was larger than it appeared from outside. The stove was excellent, a proper acorn model with a good oven. There were supplies: flour, salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, a small barrel of molasses, potatoes in a bin, and dried herbs hanging from a ceiling hook that suggested someone at some point had cooked here with genuine intention. "Those herbs were my uncle's doing," Clyde said, following her gaze. "I couldn't say what most of them are." "I can," Matilda said, reaching up to touch a bundle. "Sage, rosemary, and this is dried thyme." She turned and looked at the stove, the shelves, the window above the work table that looked out over the east pasture. The light came in clean and even. Something settled in her, something she had not expected. This was a kitchen that wanted to be used. "Where do you want the table?" Clyde asked from the doorway. She turned and looked at him. "In here," she said. "In this room for now, against the north wall." She indicated the spot, and he nodded and went back out for the table. He carried it in himself, refusing the help of Pete Avery, who had appeared from the barn with a curious expression and hay on his shirt. Pete was a wiry man in his mid-30s with a friendly, weathered face, and he introduced himself to Matilda with a handshake and an uncomplicated openness that she appreciated immediately. "You're the cook," he said. "For the month," she said. "Lord above," he said reverently. "Please tell me you can make biscuits." "I can make biscuits," she said, and his relief was so genuine and theatrical that she laughed, which surprised her. Clyde set the table down in the spot she had indicated and stood back. Matilda walked to it and placed her hands flat on the worn, smooth surface, and there it was, the grain of the wood, the slight warmth of it, the particular solidity of something built to last longer than the people who used it. Her hands remembered the surface before her eyes fully registered it. "You all right?" Clyde asked. She took her hands off the table and folded them in front of her. "Yes," she said. "Let me get started on the noon meal." She cooked that first day like she was proving something, which she supposed she was. She made a proper stew with salt pork and potatoes and the dried sage from the ceiling, and corn bread from scratch. And when the two Hands and Clyde came in at midday, the silence that fell over the table when they tasted it was the most satisfying sound she could remember hearing in a long time. Pete actually closed his eyes. "Where did you come from?" he said, not quite as a question. "Dusty Creek," she said. "Well, I wish you had come 4 months ago," he said. And Sam Rankin, who was 19 and earnest and not much for words, nodded with the solemnity of a man making a sacred agreement. Clyde watched her work, she noticed. Not intrusively, not obviously, but she caught his eyes on her from across the room more than once during that first meal. Watching the way she moved around the kitchen with the particular competence of someone who had been cooking since childhood, watching the way she managed the stove's heat, watching the way she talked easily with Pete and Sam. He was curious about her, she thought. Not in the grasping way that some men were curious about women, but in the way a person is curious about something they have encountered that doesn't fit any existing category in their mind. She admitted to herself on the ride back to town that first evening, curious about him too. The week settled into its rhythm. She came out on Sunday through Thursday, prepared the noon and evening meals, and rode the 4 miles back to town before dark in the company of the October light that made even the dusty road look like something worth painting. On Friday and Saturday she worked at the dress shop, hemming skirts and mending lace and fitting the women of Dusty Creek for the small ceremonies of their lives. On the third day, it rained. Clyde had offered her the use of his horse for the daily trip, since her own transportation was a borrowed arrangement with Hetty Marsh's cart, and the horse he gave her was a gray mare named Josephine who was sensible and steady, and did not spook at prairie dogs or passing wagons. Matilda had been riding since she was small, and she and Josephine came to a quick and wordless understanding. But when the rain came in hard on Tuesday afternoon and showed no sign of stopping before dark, Clyde came into the kitchen as she was cleaning up after supper and said, "The spare room is ready if you want it. It's not a good night for the road." She looked at the window where the rain was coming down in sheets. She thought about propriety, about what the town would say, about all the things a woman living alone had to consider about her reputation. "Pete and Sam," she said. "Pete's in the bunkhouse. Sam sleeps in the loft above the barn. Then I will take the spare room," she said, "and leave at first light." "All right," he said. He showed her to the room, which was small and clean and smelled of cedar from the blanket chest at the foot of the bed. He had put a candle on the windowsill and a pitcher of water on the dresser, and Matilda stood in the doorway looking at it and felt something move through her that she could not immediately name. "Thank you," she said. "Good night, Miss Cooper," he said, and went back down the hall to his own room. She lay in the spare bed that night and listened to the rain on the roof and the distant murmur of the cattle moving in the pasture, and she thought about how strange it was that she felt so at ease in this house. She was a woman alone on a man's property in the middle of the Texas plains in a rainstorm, and she felt safe, which was either good judgment or terrible judgment, and she was not entirely sure which. In the morning the rain had cleared and the land was washed clean and brilliant in the early light, and she found Clyde already at the stove, attempting to make coffee and managing it approximately correctly. "You don't need to do that," she said, coming into the kitchen. "It's your day off from the duty of coffee," he said. She looked at the pot. "You are not doing it correctly." "I know," he said, "but I've been not doing it correctly for 3 years and I've managed." She took the pot from him, made the adjustment, and set it back. He watched her do it. "You were raised to be self-sufficient," he said. "I was raised by a woman who believed self-sufficiency was the highest virtue," she said. "My mother believed the same," he said. "She died when I was 17. I think it's why I never quite learned to ask for help with things." Matilda looked at him. This was the most he had said about himself in 4 days, and it had come out simply and without bid for sympathy, which made it more affecting than if he had tried to make it moving. "I was 9 when my mother died," she said. "My grandmother took me in." "At the table," he said. "At the table," she said. The coffee was ready and she poured them each a cup, and they stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet and drank it. And outside the washed world was going gold with sunrise. And Matilda thought, carefully and precisely, that this was an unusually pleasant thing to be doing with a person she had known for less than a week. She thought about it more on the ride home, and more again that evening, and came to the decision that she was being perfectly practical about the situation, and that her feelings on the subject were organized and managed, which was what she told herself for approximately another week before she stopped believing it. It was the fence that did it. On Thursday of the second week, she arrived at the ranch to find that the east fence had come down in the night, apparently where a section of old post had rotted through, and Clyde was out in the south pasture trying to get the cattle settled, while Pete and Sam replaced the posts. Sam had cut his hand on the wire and was bleeding impressively, and Pete was trying to manage both the posts and the boy, and Clyde was 100 yards away managing the cattle alone. Matilda assessed the situation in approximately 10 seconds, went into the kitchen, got the clean cloth and the vinegar she knew was on the second shelf, came back out, sat Sam down on the fence rail, and cleaned and bound his hand with the competence of a woman who had been the only adult capable of managing emergencies for most of her life. "You're all right," she told him firmly, because he was 19 and pale and looking at his hand like it had betrayed him personally. "The bleeding will stop. Keep that cloth pressed hard and come inside in 10 minutes, and I will wrap it properly." She then went to the south pasture, because there was a gate at the near end, and she could see that Clyde was outnumbered by his own cattle in a way that was about to become a genuine problem. She opened the gate, went in, and with the kind of no-nonsense authority that cattle seem to recognize and respond to, began moving the herd away from the open section and back toward the center of the pasture. She did not think about what she was doing. She simply did it, the way her grandmother had taught her, because there were always animals on the Cooper land, and a leaner me had believed that a woman who could not manage livestock was a woman who would always be dependent on others to manage it for her. Clyde appeared beside her within a minute, saw what she was doing, adjusted his angle to work with her, and they moved the cattle together with the kind of wordless coordination that usually takes months to develop between working partners. At one point, a young bull tried to cut left, and she stepped into the gap before Clyde could, redirecting it with a firm shout and a wave of her arm, and when she looked up, Clyde was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was more than impressed. It was something quieter and deeper than impressed. They got the cattle settled and the gate secured and walked back across the pasture without saying much, and when they reached the barn, Clyde stopped and said, "You did not have to do that." "I know," she said. "You're covered in mud." She looked down. She was. It had gotten into the hem of her skirt and the side of her boot and apparently up her left forearm. "It'll wash," she said. He was still looking at her with that expression. She met his gaze, and for the first time since she had known him, He was the one who looked away first. She went inside to tend to Sam's hand and start the noon meal, and she gave herself precisely no time to analyze what had just happened between them. But that evening after supper, when Pete and Sam had gone to their respective quarters and the kitchen was clean and quiet, Clyde came in with a cup of coffee and sat down at Alina Mee's table and said, "Tell me about her." Matilda was drying the last of the plates. She put one down and looked at him. "My grandmother." "Yes," he said. She folded the drying cloth. She considered whether she wanted to and found that she did. She sat down across from him and told him. She told him about Alina Mee's hands, strong and brown and quick, always moving, always making something. She told him about the way the old woman sang hymns while she worked, not full-voiced but under her breath, a constant background sound like a creak. She told him about the winter mornings when the fire was low, and Alina Mee would pull Matilda close to her side and read to her from the Bible, not for religion exactly, though that was there too, but because Alina Mee believed the language of it was the most beautiful language written down, and a child should have beauty in their ears early. She told him about the smell of Alina Mee's kitchen, cinnamon and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of dried herbs, and how that table was where every significant thing in Matilda's life had happened. The meals and the reading and the crying, and the slow, steady work of becoming who she was. Clyde listened to all of it without interrupting. He held his coffee cup in both hands and listened the way some people pray with his whole quiet attention. When she finished, the kitchen was very still. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said. "She was the best person I've ever known," Matilda said. He nodded slowly. "I think I understand now what I bid against in that auction," he said. "You couldn't have known," she said. It was honest and she meant it. The anger she had felt that afternoon at the auction barn had been real, but it had no legitimate object in Clyde Keller. He had not done anything wrong. He had simply been in the way of something she needed, and he had gotten out of the way the moment he understood it. "I'm glad we're here," he said. It was simply stated, but it covered a wide territory and they both heard the full breadth of it. Matilda picked up her drying cloth again and stood up from the table. "I should start back before it gets too late," she said. "It's already late," he said. "The road will be dark in half an hour." "Then I'll ride fast," she said, and smiled. And he smiled back, and she thought, walking out to saddle Josephine, that she was extremely glad she could not see her own face at that particular moment. The third week brought a change in the weather and a change in other things too. The weather turned sharper, with the kind of cold front that comes down from the north in late October and reminds the Texas plains that winter is not interested in being gentle or gradual. Mornings were gray and stiff with frost, and riding to and from the ranch became genuinely cold. The change in other things was harder to name but equally undeniable. Clyde began helping in the kitchen after supper. Not intrusively, not with the clumsiness of a man trying to prove a point. He simply began staying, picking up a dish to dry, sitting at the table and talking while she cleaned, offering to bring in wood for the morning before he went to bed. It became a time that both of them began to look toward, without discussing the fact that they were looking toward it. They talked about everything. They talked about books. Clyde had more books than Matilda had expected, a shelf of them in the sitting room, Mark Twain and a worn copy of Moby Dick, and several volumes on cattle management and range science. They talked about cattle and about the land, and about the way the county was changing, the railroad coming through to the north, the new families arriving, the old ways of doing things pressing against new ones. They talked about the bank and about Gerald Hurst, and Clyde listened to everything she said about the man with a thoughtful expression that told her he was filing it and would not forget it. They talked about Missouri and about Georgia, and about the peculiar, stubborn optimism of people who crossed impossible distances to make something in a new place. One evening Matilda said, without quite planning to, "Did you come here to get away from something or toward something?" Clyde thought about it for a real while, which she appreciated. Toward, he said finally, though I'm not entirely sure yet what I was moving toward. He looked at her. I'm beginning to have a better idea. She kept her eyes on the dishes. You should not say things like that, she said carefully. Why not, he asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. She turned and looked at him directly. Because in 30 days I will have my table and our arrangement will be concluded, and if you say things like that in the meantime, the 30 days becomes complicated. He held her gaze. What if I want the 30 days to be complicated? She was quiet for a moment. I am not a woman who makes decisions based on what someone wants, she said. I make them based on what is sensible. Is it not sensible, he said slowly, to consider that something is happening here? She put the last dish on the shelf, folded the cloth, and turned to face him fully. It is occurring to me, she said carefully, that something may be happening here. But I have spent my entire adult life being careful, Clyde, and I am not prepared to stop being careful simply because I find you. She stopped herself and pressed her lips together. He waited. He did not rush her. I find you very difficult to be sensible around, she said finally, which was as much as she could say honestly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I can be patient. She looked at him steadily. Good, she said. She went home and thought about the word patient all the way back on the road in the cold dark, with Josephine's hooves steady on the frozen ground, and the stars spread out across the Texas sky in their unreasonable abundance. And she thought that patient was a word she trusted, because it was a word that required something of the person who said it, and Clyde Keller had said it simply and without fanfare, and she believed him. On the 22nd day, Gerald Hurst came to the ranch. Matilda was in the kitchen when she heard the horse and looked out the window to see a man in a good suit riding a clean bay horse up to the front of the house. She did not recognize him at first distance, but something about the suit made her wary. It was the suit of a man who wanted other people to notice that it was a good suit. Clyde came out of the barn and stood in the yard, and the man climbed down and they talked. Matilda could not hear the words, but she could read the body language clearly enough. Clyde's stance was politely attentive. The other man's was the particular looseness of someone who believes the conversation is already settled before it begins. After 10 minutes, the man got back on his horse and rode away, and Clyde came inside with a set expression that she had not seen on him before. Who was that? She asked. Gerald Hurst, he said. She felt the name land like a stone in still water. What did he want? Clyde took his hat off and set it on the shelf. He wants to buy the east pasture, he said. Claims he's building a new enterprise, needs the grazing rights, says it's not viable for a one-man cattle operation, and he could give me a fair price and I could restock on better land further north. He paused. He was very persuasive about how the property isn't doing as well as it should and how much money I could make by selling part of it. Matilda felt cold that had nothing to do with October. And what did you tell him? I told him I would think about it, Clyde said. I wanted to speak to you first. She blinked. To me? He looked at her directly. You know this land and you know this county better than I do, he said. And you know Gerald Hurst. She was quiet for a moment, organizing what she knew into words that were useful. Hurst has been buying up land along the eastern county line for 3 years, she said. The properties he buys tend to change hands again within a year to men he brings in from outside the county, men with money and connections. He cleared my grandmother's land the week after the funeral. The debt she carried was old, and the interest he charged over the years was— She stopped. You should get your deed looked at carefully by someone you trust, and you should not sell anything to Gerald Hurst, not 1 acre. Clyde was quiet for a moment, then nodded once definitely. All right, he said. That's all, she said. That's all, he said. I asked, you told me, and I agree with you. I'm not selling to Hurst. She felt something warm move through her that she was going to need to have a conversation with herself about later. Good, she said. Sit down. Supper's nearly ready. He sat at a leaner me's table, and she put a bowl of soup in front of him and he ate it. And outside the October wind came against the house walls, and the kitchen was warm and lit by the lamp and smelled of sage and wood smoke. And Matilda thought, standing at the stove, that this was a very specific sort of happiness she was feeling, the kind that is located in the body, in the warmth of a room and the smell of a meal and the presence of another person at a familiar table. She sat down across from him and ate her own supper, and they talked about small things, and the evening settled around them like something that belonged to them. On the 28th day, Pete Avery said something. He said it to Sam in the barn, and Matilda heard it through the kitchen window, which was open a crack for the smoke from the stove, and Pete said, "You know what I think?" And Sam said, "No," and Pete said, "I think those two are the most obvious pair of people I have ever watched pretend they don't know what's happening between them." And Sam said, "Yep." And then Pete laughed, and Matilda very deliberately did not look out the window. She looked at the table instead. 30 days, the agreement said. She had 2 days left. She had spent 4 weeks in this kitchen, at this table in this house, cooking meals for 3 men, and learning the particular rhythm of this ranch and the man who ran it. She had learned that Clyde Keller was the kind of person who noticed small things, who noticed when Pete was tired and gave him a light day, who noticed when the horse was favoring its left foreleg and had the farrier out before anyone else mentioned it. She had learned that he read at night, that he kept the accounts in a careful hand, that he said what he meant and meant what he said, which in her experience was rarer than most people acknowledged. She had learned that she did not want to leave. This was the honest thing, and she sat with it that morning at a leaner me's table with a cup of coffee and let it be honest. She did not want to leave the table. She did not want to leave the kitchen or the house or the east pasture or the ranch. And she did not want to leave Clyde Keller, which was an entirely different category of not wanting to leave and had to be treated with appropriate seriousness. On the 29th day, Clyde came into the kitchen after supper and sat down at the table and said, "I need to talk to you about something." She sat across from him, her hands around her cup. "All right," she said. He turned his hat once in his hands. "The 30 days is done day after tomorrow," he said. "Yes." "The table will be yours." "Yes." He looked at her. "I don't want you to take the table and leave," he said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, something moved in the darkness, an owl, a night creature of some kind, and then silence. "Clyde," she said. "I know what I said," he said. "I said I could be patient, and I meant it, and I have been patient. But patient doesn't mean silent, and I think you know what I'm trying to say, and I think you've known for a while, and I think you have been thinking about it as carefully as you think about everything." He paused. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to tell me whether I'm wrong about what I think is happening." She was quiet for a long moment. "You are not wrong," she said. Something in him eased visibly, like a door that had been held against a wind finding it had stopped. "I am not someone who does things recklessly," she said. "I need you to understand that. I know that. I have spent a great deal of my life managing things alone," she said. "My grandmother taught me to be independent, and I am good at it. The idea of letting that of trusting someone with the parts of myself that I usually manage privately," she stopped. "It does not come easily to me." "I know that too," he said. "But," she said, and she felt the word was large and consequential, and she said it anyway. "But I would like to try." Clyde Keller looked at her across Eleanor Mee's table, in the lamplight, in the quiet kitchen that smelled of the evening supper, and his expression was one of the most unguarded things she had ever seen on a person. He was not a man who showed his feelings easily, she had learned, but they were there, deep and steady, like water in a well that is always cold and always clean and always exactly what it is. "I would like that very much," he said. They sat at the table for a long time that evening, talking more easily than they had yet, as if a gate had been opened, and eventually Matilda said she should start back and Clyde said the road was dark and cold, and she should take the spare room, and she said all right, and went to bed in the cedar-smelling room and lay in the dark, and felt something she had almost forgotten was available to her, a particular kind of lightness. The lightness of a weight that has been carried alone for so long that it becomes invisible, until suddenly it is not there anymore. The 30th day came clear and cold and brilliant, and Clyde had the table moved to the front porch by the time Matilda arrived, and on it he had placed the signed bill of sale with the table described carefully and her name written as the new owner in his neat, careful hand. She stood on the porch and looked at the bill of sale and then at the table and then at him. "It's yours," he said. "All yours." She picked up the bill of sale and held it, and she thought about a leaner me, and she thought about the auction barn, and she thought about $34.60 and the desperation that had driven her to this porch, and then she thought about everything that had happened in the 30 days between that moment and this one, and she said, "I would like to leave it here for a while if you don't mind." He looked at her, surprised. "The table," she said. "I would like to leave it where it is, if that is agreeable." His face did something very quiet and very significant. "That is agreeable," he said. She came back the next day and cooked supper, and the day after that, and the one after that, but the arrangement now was different. It was not a transaction. It was a choice. She chose to come, and she knew he was glad she came, and Pete Avery whistled under his breath the first morning he saw her coming up the road and had the decency not to say anything about it in front of either of them. The winter came to Dusty Creek with its usual lack of ceremony, dropping temperatures overnight and bringing the first hard freeze in mid-November. Matilda was at the ranch the morning of the first freeze, and she stood on the back porch in her coat and watched the frost on the dead grass catch the light, and Clyde came to stand beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and they stood there together without speaking for several minutes. "This is the part of the year I find hardest," she said. "Everything looks dead." "It's not dead," he said. "It's just waiting." He handed her a cup. She wrapped her hands around it. "You are an optimistic person," she said. "My mother was," he said. "I think it's the only inheritance that really travels." She turned and looked at him. His profile against the frozen morning was certain and quiet, the kind of face that does not change with the weather. She thought about all the mornings of her life, the lonely ones and the managed ones, and the ones where she had woken in her narrow room above the dress shop and felt the weight of solo life as a genuinely physical thing. And she looked at Clyde Keller in the cold morning light and thought, with a clarity that was almost startling, that she did not want any more of those mornings. "Clyde," she said. He turned. She kissed him, which surprised both of them considerably. Her coffee cup tilted and sloshed, and he caught it before it fell, which made her laugh. And then he was laughing too, both of them standing on the frozen porch in the early morning holding 2 cups of coffee and laughing like people who have been given permission to be happy. He kissed her back properly and set both cups on the porch rail and held her face in his cold hands with a gentleness that she felt in her sternum for the rest of the day. They told Pete and Sam at noon dinner. Pete looked at the ceiling and said, "Lord above, finally," with such sincere relief that Sam actually smiled, which was unusual enough to be notable. The months that followed were the best of Matilda's adult life, which she acknowledged honestly and without qualification. She kept her room above the dress shop through the winter and continued working her half-weeks there, because she was not a woman who gave up her independence in stages, and she wanted to be sure, genuinely sure, before she made changes that could not be unmade. But she was at the ranch more days than not, and the kitchen became more hers than anything she had lived with in years, and a leaner me's table was at the center of all of it, as it had always been at the center of things. Clyde courted her with a combination of practical attention and quiet feeling that suited her perfectly. He did not bring flowers, because he was not a man who thought in flowers. He brought her a new leather pair of riding gloves when he noticed her old ones were cracked through, without mentioning it or making it a ceremony, just setting them on the kitchen shelf one morning. He read to her from the books in his sitting room on the evenings when supper was done, and the lamp was lit, and neither of them wanted the night to end yet. He listened to her with his whole attention, which remained the most romantic thing she had ever experienced. In February, the issue with Gerald Hurst came to a head. Hurst had apparently not taken Clyde's refusal of his first offer as final, and had come back twice more through the winter with new arguments, and then with a letter from a county land assessor that Clyde brought to Matilda with a narrow expression. "He's claiming there's a disputed boundary on the east pasture," Clyde said. "Says the original survey was done incorrectly, and part of the creek land doesn't belong to my uncle's deed." Matilda read the letter twice. Then she said, "Do you have the original deed? In the strong box. Get it." They spread the deed on a leaner Mies table in the kitchen, and Matilda read every line of the property description with the focused attention she applied to dress patterns and account books. And then she said, "This is incorrect. Not your deed. Hurst's claim. The boundary markers he's citing were changed in the county assessment of 1877, and the survey recorded at that time clearly extended your uncle's boundary to include the full creek branch. I know because I watched the assessors do it when I was 9 years old, and I remember exactly where they put the markers because I thought they were burying treasure." Clyde stared at her. "I was 9, she said. "I was an imaginative child." He laughed. "Where would those markers be now? Still there if they haven't been disturbed. They were iron pins driven into the ground at the base of the 3 cottonwood trees on the south bank. They rode out to the South Creek bank the next morning in the February cold and found all 3 iron pins exactly where Matilda said they were, right where the cottonwoods grew in their ragged line, and Clyde stood looking at them with an expression of profound satisfaction. "That settles it," he said. They took the information to the county recorder in town, and with the deed and the physical markers, the dispute was resolved cleanly and decisively in Clyde's favor, and Gerald Hurst did not come back after that. The man was not someone who accepted defeat graciously, but he was also not someone who pressed a losing hand publicly, and the matter was closed. On the ride back from the county office that day, Clyde said, "You know this land better than any survey." "My grandmother taught me to pay attention to the land," Matilda said. "She said a person who doesn't know the land under their feet is a person who doesn't fully know themselves." He was quiet for a moment. "I think you should know that I intend to ask you to marry me," he said. "I wanted to say it plainly and in advance so that when I do ask, you have had time to think about it properly and are not put on the spot." Matilda looked at him. The February sky was enormous above the plains, gray-white and clean, and the horses walked steadily on the cold road. "That is perhaps the most practical approach to a marriage proposal I have ever heard of," she said. "Do you want me to be less practical?" He asked. She thought about it. "No," she said. "No, I think I like it very much." He nodded. They rode in silence for a while, and then she said, "I have thought about it." He looked at her. "You said I should have time to think about it," she said. "I have thought about it. I have been thinking about it for several months, actually, longer than I have admitted to anyone, including myself." She kept her eyes on the road. "When you ask me, Clyde, my answer will be yes." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they rode the rest of the way back to the ranch like that, in the cold February afternoon, hand in hand on the Painted Creek Road. He asked her properly the following Sunday. He had not planned it ostentatiously. There was no crowd, no theater. It was just the two of them in the kitchen after the Sunday noon meal, and Pete and Sam had gone about their afternoon business, and Clyde put down his coffee cup and said, "Matilda Cooper," and she looked up from the cloth she was folding, and he said, "I would like you to marry me. I think we are good for each other, and I think we are good together, and I would like to spend the rest of my life at this table with you." He said this table, and she felt it all the way to the bottom of her heart, that he understood what the table meant and had chosen to make it central to the asking, and that was, she thought, exactly right. "Yes," she said, "I will." He came around the table and she stood up, and he held her the way a man holds something he has been afraid of losing without knowing he was afraid of it, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solidness of him, the realness of him, and thought about her grandmother's voice, saying this family does not break, child, and felt, for the first time in many years, that the full weight of that family was not resting on her shoulders alone. They were married in April, when the Bluebonnets came up along the painted creek road and made the drive to the small, dusty creek church look like something from a painting. It was not a large wedding. Matilda had no family left aside from a distant cousin in Austin who sent a letter and a carved wooden spoon, and Clyde's people were all back in Missouri. But Pete Avery was there in his best shirt looking genuinely moved, and Sam Rankin stood very straight in the second pew and managed to keep his composure through most of the ceremony. Hetty Marsh from the dress shop sat in the front and cried openly and without apology. The minister, Reverend Cole, who had buried Eleanor Me 6 months before, performed the ceremony with a kind of quiet satisfaction, as if this were a thing he had been hoping would happen. Matilda wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with a small lace collar, and she carried a bunch of wildflowers that Clyde had gotten up before dawn to cut from the creek bank. When she came into the church and walked down the aisle and saw him standing at the front, in his good coat and his cleaned boots, turning his hat in his hands as he always did when he was working something out, she thought that she had never in her life felt more certain of anything. He saw her come in and stopped turning his hat. The ceremony was plain and earnest and entirely fitting for the two of them. They said their vows looking at each other steadily, the way they always looked at each other, without blinking or looking away. The reception was at the ranch, in the kitchen and spilling out onto the back porch, and Eleanor Me's table was at the center of it, covered with food that Matilda and Hetty and Pete's wife Loretta had been cooking since the day before. People ate and talked, and someone brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard as the April evening came on warm and fragrant, and Matilda danced with her husband in the grass under the enormous Texas stars, and thought that she had come into the auction barn in October with $34.60 and a piece of her grandmother's heart, and she had come out of it with this house, this table, this man, this life. It seemed, in the best possible way, like more than she had bargained for. The first year of marriage was a working year, as it tends to be when two self-sufficient and opinionated people are learning to share a life without losing the edges of themselves that made them who they were. They had arguments, because Matilda had opinions about the cattle management and Clyde had opinions about the kitchen accounts, and they both had very strong opinions about almost everything, and expressed them clearly and sometimes loudly. But they also had evenings at the table, and morning coffee on the back porch, and the steady, deepening pleasure of a person whose presence in your life makes things make more sense, and the arguments always resolved and the evenings were always good. And by the end of the first year they had found the rhythm of themselves together, which is the real work of a marriage and the thing that no ceremony can produce, only time. In the spring of their second year together, Matilda told Clyde she was expecting. She told him at breakfast at the table, because that was where they told each other important things, and he sat very still for a moment the way he did when something had moved him more deeply than he knew how to immediately express, and then he reached across the table and took her hands in his. "Are you well?" he said first, because that was Clyde. His first response to any large news was to check that the person in front of him was all right. "I am well," she said. He held her hands and said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "Eleanor Me would have loved this." Matilda had not expected that to be what he said, and it went directly to the center of her chest and stayed there. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "Yes," she said, "she would have." "We'll have a full table," he said. "We will," she said. Their son was born in December of 1884, a big healthy boy with Clyde's dark hair and Matilda's creekwater eyes, and they named him Daniel after Eleanor Me's husband who had not made it to Texas but whose family had carried on without him. Daniel Cooper Keller arrived on a cold December morning with considerably less ceremony than expected, in the bedroom of the ranch house with the midwife from town, and Clyde sitting on the wrong side of the door turning his hat in his hands, until Matilda told him through the door to come in. He came in and saw the baby, and went very quiet in the way he always did when something was bigger than his words. He held Daniel at the kitchen table that evening. the baby small and round-faced and entirely unimpressed by the world. And Matilda sat across from him with her coffee and watched this man she had married hold their son at her grandmother's table, and felt the leaner me in the room as clearly as if the old woman were standing at the stove. Pete Avery came in from the barn to see the baby and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, looking at the scene with an expression so genuinely tender that Matilda stored it away among the things she intended to remember as long as she lived. "A boy," Pete said. "Daniel," Clyde said. "Good name," Pete said and nodded and went back out to the barn. By the spring of 1885, the Keller ranch had expanded. Clyde bought the adjacent property to the north, which had been going at a fair price, and hired 2 additional hands, and Matilda had given up the dress shop entirely and was managing the household accounts with a precision and intelligence that Clyde sometimes told her was frightening. "You see numbers the way you see land," he told her once. "Like you already know what they're going to do." "My grandmother kept accounts for the whole family," she said. "She taught me before I knew enough to be confused." "She taught you everything," he said. "Almost everything," she said, looking at him. "I learned some things on my own." He smiled, slow and warm, the smile that she had first glimpsed at the corner of his mouth at the auction barn, and had been watching expand ever since into the full, genuine thing it was. In 1886, Gerald Hurst's bank ran into difficulties that Matilda had frankly seen coming for 3 years, because a business model built on pressuring people into impossible debt, and then taking their land does not sustain itself indefinitely. And by the autumn of that year, the First Commercial Bank of Dusty Creek had new management, and Hurst himself had relocated to San Antonio, where his reputation and his methods were unknown, and where he could presumably begin again. Matilda heard this news from Hetty Marsh on a Friday morning when she came into town for supplies, and she stood in the main street of Dusty Creek in the October sunshine, exactly 4 years after the autumn when she had walked into Harlan Beecroft's auction barn with $34.60, and felt a particular quiet satisfaction. She thought about her grandmother's land. It could not be recovered. That was simply true and had to be lived with. But the debt was gone, and the man who had pressed it was gone, and the land she had now was broader and richer than anything a leaner me had worked, and a leaner me's table was at the center of it. She thought that was something. She drove back to the ranch with the supplies in the wagon, and came around the east side of the house to find Clyde mending the fence along the kitchen garden with Daniel, who was nearly 2 and deeply devoted to the project of being wherever his father was, sitting in the dirt nearby, inspecting a rock, with the focused attention of a person who believes he may have discovered something important. Clyde looked up when she came around the corner. He read her face with the easy fluency of a man who has been paying close attention to someone for 4 years. "Good news," he said. "Hurst is gone," she said. Something moved through his face, not quite satisfaction, not quite relief, something broader than either. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. Daniel looked up from his rock, saw his mother, and opened his arms with the absolute confidence of a person who has never once been dropped. She picked him up and held him on her hip and looked over his dark head at her husband mending the fence in the October afternoon, on the land they had built together, 4 miles east of Dusty Creek on the Painted Creek Road. In 1887, Matilda discovered she was expecting again, and this time there was less stillness on Clyde's face and more of the smile that still occasionally managed to surprise her with how fully it transformed his whole expression. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she said. "Boy or girl, what do you think?" he asked. She considered. "Girl," she said. "This one feels different." She was right. Margaret Eleanor Keller arrived in July of 1887, named for the grandmother who had never been forgotten and never would be. And Margaret arrived with Matilda's copper hair and Clyde's dark eyes, which reversed the combination in a way that the whole family found satisfying. Pete Avery, now firmly established as a permanent part of the Keller household rather than merely an employee, saw Margaret for the first time and said with great solemnity, This one's going to run the county someday." "She is 2 days old," Clyde said. "I know what I see," Pete said. Sam Rankin had married the previous fall, a quiet and sensible girl from the next county named Rose, and they had built a small house on the north edge of the property that Clyde had sold them at an honest price. The Keller Ranch had become, by the late 1880s, something more than a working cattle operation. It was a community of its own, the kind of small, interlocking world that grew up organically in the wide spaces of the Texas plains when people chose to stay and build rather than move on. Matilda managed the household with the same organized precision she brought to everything, and she cooked at a leaner me's table every day. And in the evenings when Daniel was old enough, she began to teach him to read, tracing the letters on the worn, smooth surface of the table with her finger, the way her grandmother had traced them for her. She noticed the day he first traced a letter back without help. She noticed the exact quality of the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window and the exact feel of the table's surface under her hand, and the exact expression on her son's face when he understood that the marks on the page meant something. She thought, "This is what a table does when it is kept." She thought, "This is what a leaner me meant." Clyde was in the kitchen doorway when it happened, because he came home at noon and often lingered in the kitchen for the pleasure of being where his family was, and he saw Matilda's face in the moment she watched Daniel trace the letter, and he recognized the expression on it. It was the same expression she had worn in the auction barn on the day he first saw her, the expression of someone to whom something matters profoundly and completely. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and watched his son learn to read, and his wife's hand over the child's hand over the worn, smooth wood of the table that had been crossed from Georgia in the back of a wagon by a woman with 3 children under 7, and felt, with the kind of certainty that takes years to grow into and does not go away, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That evening, after Daniel and Margaret were in bed, Matilda and Clyde sat at the table the way they always sat at the end of the day, with their coffee cups and the lamp burning between them and the quiet house around them, and the ranch stretching out into the Texas night. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the auction," she said. "I was thinking about walking in there with $34.60 and being absolutely certain that would be enough." He smiled. "You were so certain," he said. "I was furious when it wasn't," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell. You looked troubled," she said. "Not pleased with yourself, troubled. That's what made me look back." He held his coffee cup in both hands. "I had a feeling even then that I had done something without understanding what I was doing. I don't like that feeling." "You made it right," she said. "You gave me the opportunity to make it right," he said. "You could have walked out of that barn and never spoken to me." She thought about it. "I almost did," she said honestly. "I was halfway to convincing myself that the table was just a table." "It was never just a table," he said. "No," she said. "It never was." She looked at the surface of it, worn and familiar, darkened at the base, tilted just fractionally to the left. It had been the center of a leaner me's kitchen for 40 years, and now it was the center of hers. And it had been the place where she learned to read, and where she had cried for her mother, and where she had sat across from Clyde Keller on the night he had said, "Tell me about her," and listened to everything she needed to say. It had been bid on by strangers and written into a contract and carried in a wagon bed and carried again into this kitchen where it had been lived against every day for years. It was 30 inches of oak in a slight leftward tilt, and it was the whole of her family's history, and it was exactly where it should be. "I used to be afraid," she said, "that I would spend my life managing everything alone. And now," he said. She looked at him across the table, her husband in the lamplight with his hands around his coffee cup and his dark eyes steady on her face, present and patient and entirely himself. "Now I know that managing things together is not the same as not being able to manage them alone," she said. "It's just better." He smiled, the full, warm smile that had been expanding since the auction barn. "Yes," he said, "it is." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and the lamp burned quietly, and the house settled around them, And outside on the painted creek road the Texas night was wide and full of stars, the same stars that Alina Me had navigated by, and before her the woman who had crossed from Georgia, and the whole long line of people who had made this life possible, was present in the kitchen in some way that was not mystical but simply true. The table had been in the family for generations. It would pass to Daniel, and to Margaret, and to their children after them, worn smoother each decade, tilting its gentle leftward tilt through all the years of all the meals and all the lessons and all the conversations it would hold. Matilda thought that Alina Me would be satisfied. She thought, sitting at the table in the lamplight with her husband's hand warm under hers and her children asleep in their rooms, and the whole of the life she had built spread out around her in every direction. She thought that she was satisfied too. Not the passive satisfaction of someone who has settled for something, but the deep, earned satisfaction of someone who has fought for what matters and found that what matters was, in the end, worth every hard thing that came before it. She pressed Clyde's hand. He turned his palm up and held hers. The fire settled in the stove. The stars burned steadily over Texas. And at the center of the warm kitchen on the Keller Ranch, 4 miles east of Dusty Creek, Alina Me Cooper's table held everything that had ever mattered and everything that ever would.